Welcome back to Car Ski Go. We got the wheels off the car today because we're going to be doing some brake pads. And yes, the car's filthy. I'm going to clean it after I do this. I just didn't want to work in a pool of water, so sorry for the dirty car. So let's talk a little bit about brake pads and why I'm doing this. The pads on there are fine. They've got plenty of meat on them. However, they're more of like a street pad, and it's the OEM pad. Very good for the street, very quiet, doesn't really dust very much. But in a track environment where you're generating a lot of heat, they're not gonna do as well as a track-oriented pad. So that's the first major thing that separates a track pad from a normal OEM pad, is that they can handle the high temperatures of the track much better than an OEM pad can. OEM pads, when you get them very hot, they'll start to lose bite, and then you'll push on the pedal and nothing will happen. On the track, not very good thing to have. And one of the reasons for that is the second part of track pads is the coefficient of friction. And sometimes it's called mu. And the coefficient of friction determines how much bite there is between the pad and the rotor. The higher coefficient of friction you have, the more bite you have. The lower, the less bite you have. And coefficient of friction is not something that's static. It changes with heat. So an OEM pad might have a very high initial coefficient of friction when the pad is cold, so that, you know, in the middle of winter your car will actually stop when you hit the pedal. But then as you get into high temperatures, say 300 or 400 or 500 degrees, like where you see on a track, the coefficient of friction tapers off, so you don't have as much stopping power. Now, there's also things like outgassing and everything else that can lead to you having less braking force when you are at the track in high temperature situations. However, one of them is just that the coefficient of friction of the pad will fall off a little bit, and that's determined by material composition usually. So now if we go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum with track pads might have a very small coefficient of friction, or smaller relative coefficient of friction, when the pad is cold. So if you put pure track pads on your car and you go drive in the middle of winter, that first stop might be a little bit interesting because it'll feel like you have no brakes. But as temperature goes up, the coefficient of friction rises and can even be, higher than what an OEM pad would be at cold. And so that's what you want on the track. You want your coefficient of friction to be high at those high temperatures, because that's where your brakes are living when you're on the track. So those are kind of like the two extremes. Now, as I said, I don't want to go for a full track pad because I drive the car every day. So I want something that has characteristics of both, which is how I settled on these guys. These have a pretty much OEM coefficient of friction. However, they have that from very cold to very hot. So they're basically an OEM pad that you can't overheat. And that's how I picked them. And that, of course, in price as well. You can get some very pricey pads for this car that are excellent and they're super track focused, but they could be $600 for a set of 4, and you'll blow through them in 4 or 5 track days. I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for best bang for my buck. So I'm going with these guys. They're Ferodo DS 2500s. Ferodo is not a sponsor of this channel. It's just what I happen to pick after reading some reviews. And today, we're going to go about installing them in here and see how that goes. What you're going to see me do applies to a lot of calipers that are kind of racing style calipers, like these Porsche's brakes are, which are actually Brembo. These look very familiar to what I had on the 350Z, so if you have a caliper like this, you can follow these procedures. If you have something that's not as sporty, I guess you could say, or just has more of like an OEM caliper look, then these instructions probably won't work, but I don't know, maybe. So anyway, first step, remove the clip. Second step is these pads are supported by this pin right here. So usually you'd use like a drift or something, but all I have is my screwdriver and a hammer. So I'm just gonna go ahead and pop this out. One slider pin out. And you've got this little bridge right here, which also contains the cable for, this car has brake wear sensors. So there's a sensor on each pad here that if it contacts the rotor, it'll tell you that your brake pads are too low and it's time to change. So the pads that we're putting in do not have the notch that's needed. I'll show you the notch in a minute. So these are just going to be tied up someplace out of the way where they don't touch anything metal, so they'll never set the brake sensor off. So now I got to get the pads out. So I usually try to come in from behind the caliper here, and the pad sticks below the caliper, and just pry on the hat of the rotor a little bit just to free them up. Get everything moving. Then I kind of use that one to free up the other side without prying on the caliper itself, because I don't want to screw up my nice red paint. One. The corrosion and everything's making this a little bit difficult. Two. All right, so you can see how on these two pads here, they've got this little divot in the pad for these sensors. And these sensors should just pull out. Wiggle it out, one. Wiggle it out, too. Okay, so since we are not using these sensors anymore, undo this clip from here. Get the cable out. The next thing we got to do is compress the pistons. There's 4 pistons in this caliper, 2 here and 2 here. And right now, because these pads are much thinner than the new pad won't fit in there. So the next step is to compress the pistons back into the caliper so that we can make some room. The way I like to do it is to open up one of the bleed screws, push some fluid out, because in the past I have seen people just push the fluid right back up into the master cylinder. However, I did that once, and a couple days later I had an ABS pump failure on one of my old cars, and that was a huge pain in the butt job. So now I don't even risk it. I just crack the bleed screw a little bit so I see a little bit of fluid come out. Then I get this handy dandy tool, which is specific for these style of calipers. They sell a very expensive one, like a $600 or $700 version of this. However, I think this is like 40 bucks on Amazon, and if I can find the link for it still, I'll put it in the comments below. But what it allows you to do is squeeze the pistons back into the caliper, all 4 at the same time. Now what can happen is if you don't have that in there, you can do it, it's just more of a pain in the butt. But what you don't want to happen is you don't want to push this piston in over here without this piston being supported, because you potentially could blow it out of the bore, and then you just made a lot more work for yourself. So for having something like this is great. There you go. Let me see. You can see now that I can fit my whole hand in there. So there's plenty of room. Now, next thing that I haven't seen this before on the Brembos on the Z, but on the Porsche, they've got these little backing plates in here that are supposed to prevent pad squeal. So let me see if I can get it out and I'll show you. So you've got this face and you've got these 2 little nubs, and these nubs actually fit into the bore of the pistons in there. And you see there's a big one and a small one because there's a slightly bigger piston on the top than there is on the bottom, and that's to distribute the pad pressure evenly so that you get even pad wear. What I've read is that these connect to the back of the pad. When you buy them new, they'll come with like a sticky substance on it, so that way the pad is actually part of the caliper and it creates less squealing. since I'm reusing these, I went online and I found that the tape that you want to use to connect these two pieces, this to the back of the pad, is 3M 467 MP adhesive. It's really thin, and I'll show you how to put it on in a minute. But I'm going to go ahead and off camera, I'm just going to wire wheel these up and clean them up and get them ready to go. And there's one on each side of the caliper here. Sometimes these get corroded in the bores of the piston, which I'm hoping is not the case right now. It's fighting me a little bit. Alright, I'm going to do this off camera. I'll be back once they're all off and clean. Unfortunately, it was the case that this piece on the other side will not come out. This part right here is frozen in the bore, and since I don't really think it matters that much and I don't feel like taking the whole caliper off, I'm just going to leave it in there. So what I did is I hit it with some brake clean and some steel wool just to clean this face off, and instead of putting the tape on this face, I'm just going to put the tape on the back of the brake pads so that when they push together in the caliper, it'll just make the connection at that point. Not a big deal. So I'm going to go ahead, pop this guy in, and then get the tape on the brake pads. Alright, there we go. So I'm not sure if you can see, but the tape's on there. It's extremely thin, and it's very can withstand very high temperatures. Ugh, it took me a while to get that out, and it sticks very well to metal. So I'm going with it. We'll see what happens. Brake pads go back in. Just like putting toast in a toaster. Bridge goes back in. Caliper slider bolt goes back in. Sometimes it needs a few taps. Pin goes back in. And then we're going to tie these up and out of the way. Just tying them right up onto the lighting's pretty bad, but tying them right up to the strut tower here, or the strut, with the sensor part facing away from anything metal. Sure your bleed screw is closed. Put your dust cap on, and that's it. You're done. Well, you're almost done. Now we're done. Nice and clean. So before I did that, I stomped on the brake pedal because we pushed all the pistons back into the caliper. So there's a little bit of a gap there, and if you go out on the road and you start driving right away, you're probably gonna throw on the brakes and your car's not gonna stop. So you need to push on the brake pedal to get all the pistons right up against the pads so that they're ready for action. And then the rears were basically just the same as the fronts, with the exception of some of the backing plates, which I'll show you in a little clip right here. You can see that the rear setup is a little bit different. These are the backing plates that actually go onto the back of the brake pads, and these are the things that get inserted into the caliper that retains it in the piston there. So the interface between these two is where the tape's going to go, between here and there, just like that. Okay, so that was the rears. And the only thing that's really left to do is to go out and bed the pads, which you should always do via the manufacturer's instructions. Usually that just involves going to find an open road, taking it up to 60, slamming on the brakes, and doing that over and over again until you start to smell the brakes. And then try to drive for a little bit of time without touching them or touching them lightly. Try to do it near a highway so you can run for about 10 or 20 minutes to let the brakes completely cool. Although every manufacturer's got their own recommendations for how to do that, so make sure you check with them. Anyway, I hope that you guys learned something, and I hope you enjoyed what you saw. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and if you did like what you saw, don't forget to subscribe. This wasn't a whole special just on brake pads. If you have any other questions about choosing brake pads, you can leave them in the comments below and I'll try to get to them. So once again, thanks for watching.